Just weeks ago, we covered this incredibly disturbing and infuriating story from the Marcy Correctional Facility in upstate New York, where inmate Robert Brooks would never be given the opportunity to leave after serving his time, becoming yet another victim to our country's inhumane criminal justice system. We now have some important updates to report, but first, in case you aren't familiar with this completely preventable tragedy, here are some excerpts of redacted body cam footage released by New York Attorney General Letitia James's office.
Corrections officer Michael Along captured the moment Brooks was literally carried into the prison infirmary while his hands were still restrained behind his back, following his fellow officers to a room down the hall where you can briefly see at least one of the officers digging his knee into the back of Brooks's leg with his full body weight on top of him as more officers filter into the hallway and his room. We pick back up with Sergeant Trombley's body cam, which shows Brooks in his green jumpsuit with his hands restrained, surrounded by at least 6 officers. We unfortunately may never know what was being said here because the footage was recorded while the body cams were not activated but in standby mode. And New York AG Letitia James's office redacted certain info per department policy. Now, just over a minute later, all hell breaks loose in the examination room as one officer appears to hit Brooks with his own shoe before striking Brooks with multiple punches, all the while the other officers watch. From Corrections Officer Matthew Gallagher's perspective, we see one officer shove a white substance, presumably a cloth or tissue, into Brooks's mouth, while the second officer locks his hands around Brooks's neck just before the third officer begins beating him with his shoe and punching his legs. The officer on Brooks's left also appeared to never have let go of his neck, choking him the entire time and throwing him around by his neck, while another officer continued hitting him with his shoe, forcing him into an upright sitting position as the beating continued. 3 officers then force him to lie back down on the exam table. Now back to Sergeant Trombley's body cam. We see an officer stomp on and shove his boot into Brooks' stomach as 2 officers restrain his head and neck, while a 4th officer takes a free shot at Brooks' stomach and groin. Yet another officer joins the fray and restrains Brooks' legs as he lays defenseless on the table. The irony of such an act of brutality occurring inside a medical examination room is a perfect encapsulation of our criminal justice system. Even in one of the only possible places where a prisoner can still feel like a human with dignity while in custody, it can be snatched away at a moment's notice because of the culture the system has cultivated and perpetuated. Brooks is then punched multiple times again by the officer restraining his left leg as at least 2 officers continue putting both of their body weights down on Brooks' upper body. He is then shackled while remaining on the table for another minute or so as the officers look on. He is then shoved up into a sitting position yet again, with his face bloodied and showing clear signs of the injuries he sustained thus far just through his body language alone. And just seconds later, the officer holding the back of Brooks's neck lands a savage punch to his completely exposed ribcage as he struggles to minimize the damage as much as possible from the attack. Around 30 seconds after suffering the blow to his chest, Brooks is then picked up by the collar of his shirt off of the table and shoved into the corner of the exam room. There are at least 7 officers who could have stepped up and stopped the beating way before it even got to this point. But when you're trained to view prisoners as second-class citizens and not deserving of the same basic rights and dignity as anyone else, as well as being incentivized to continue treating them this way, then you can't be surprised that these are the horror stories we expect to see and hear.
But according to court documents, the medical examiner's preliminary findings show, quote, concern for asphyxia due to compression of the neck. Robert Brooks was 43 years old.
The barbarity of the American prison system and our country's attitude towards criminals and other incarcerated people is exactly why we keep seeing preventable tragedies like this happen every year. And thankfully, we're finally starting to see the first steps toward justice for Robert Brooks and his family over 2 months since his death while in state custody.
Hey guys, quick break in the action. I have a new show coming out called The Rick Strom Show. It is going to be awesome. I'm interviewing musicians, athletes, producers, writers, journalists, authors, sports doctors. Go check it out at youtube.com/@TheRickStrom Show. Also be sure to throw me a follow on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky. It can all be found in the description box below. Thank you.
6 former officers charged with murder. All 6 plus 3 others charged with manslaughter.
So far, a total of 10 former Marcy Corrections officers are facing murder and or manslaughter charges stemming from the killing of Brooks, notably Sergeant Glenn Trombley and Officer Michael Along. 2 of the officers who had their body cam footage released, as well as the 3 nurses on duty during the time of the beating, have not been charged as of this recording. 2 of the nurses, along with multiple other prison employees, are facing civil lawsuits from Brooks's family, and there are reports circulating of other prison employees agreeing to plea deals, though the details have not been made public as of now.
An autopsy finding Brooks died from homicide caused by asphyxia due to neck compression and multiple blunt force injuries.
Murderer! Murderer! Murderer!
5 of them: Nicholas Anzalone, David Kingsley, Anthony Farina, Christopher Walrath, and Matthew Gallagher, facing murder charges. 3 other corrections officers, David Walters, Michael Fisher, and Michael Mashaw, facing charges of manslaughter. And 1, Nicholas Gentile, of tampering with evidence. All defendants pleading not guilty today.
Waive formal proceedings entered and plead not guilty to all charges at this time.
And released on bail, or in Gentile's case, of his own recognizance. Brooks was serving a 12-year sentence for stabbing his girlfriend. Robert Brooks's father, among those watching today from the courtroom.
You marched him out, you let him go. My son didn't get that opportunity. My son didn't have a bail. And my son didn't have a murder charge.
Regardless of the prison sentence Brooks was serving, no inmate should ever fear for their life and be treated with such callousness and a lack of humanity that these officers showed.
A 2023 investigation by the Marshall Project in the New York Times found that from 2010 to 2022, New York's Department of Corrections filed 5,642 disciplinary cases against prison staff, but only succeeded in firing 28 officers. 3 of the guards involved in the assault against Brooks were previously accused of beating inmates in a similar manner.
Brooks's death is far from an anomaly. It's a feature of the system and the culture. Such a brutal system cultivates over decades upon decades of human suffering, predominantly from Black and other non-white Americans.
If you can and are willing, please become a paid member here at TYTSports. And or go to tyt.com/join. In addition, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Appreciate it. Have a great day.